Grok is Elon Musk's chatbot. Ask it enough questions about religion, and it will eventually give you an answer that sounds like a revelation. But here's the thing. Nobody selling you that clip wants you to explain. Grok didn't discover anything. It read the same public information anyone could read and repackaged it as a secret. The real story underneath the clickbait is actually more interesting than the fake one, so let's tell it properly. Open almost any Bible printed in the English-speaking world, and you will find 66 books. Open a Bible used in the Ethiopian Orthodox Theological Church, and you will find 81. 46 in the Old Testament, 35 in the New. That is not a rounding error or a marketing gimmick. It is the largest biblical canon in continuous use anywhere in Christianity, and it has been that way for well over 1,000 years, not because of some AI chatbot in 2026, but because of a specific, traceable, and well-documented history that most Western Christians simply were never taught. To understand why, you have to start with how Christianity got to Ethiopia in the first place, because the story is older and stranger than most people expect. The traditional starting point found in the book of Acts is the account of an Ethiopian court official, a treasurer serving under the Kandake, the queen of the Ethiopian kingdom of Meroe, who was baptized after reading the prophet Isaiah on the road from Jerusalem. That's a first-century account of a single conversion, not the founding of a national church. The actual institutional Christianization of Ethiopia happened later, in the 4th century, and it has a name attached to it, Frumentius. Frumentius was a Syro-Phoenician Christian who, according to the historian Rufinus, was shipwrecked on the coast of the Red Sea as a boy along with his brother Aedasius. The two were taken into the court of the kingdom of Axum, and over time, Frumentius rose to a position of influence, eventually becoming a tutor and advisor to the young King Ezana. Through that relationship, Christianity moved from the margins of Axumite society into its center. Ezana, whose reign is documented not just through Christian chronicles, but through his own inscriptions and through coins that physically survive today, is the king who converted Axum to Christianity. And those coins are historically significant for a simple reason. They show a shift from pagan solar and lunar symbols to the Christian cross, one of the earliest instances anywhere in the world of a monarch putting the cross on official currency. This places Ethiopia's conversion in the same general era as the Roman empires under Constantine, but as an independent development in an independent kingdom, not as an import from Rome or Constantinople. Frumentius later traveled to Alexandria and was consecrated as the first bishop of Axum by Athanasius, the Patriarch of Alexandria, which is why the Ethiopian Church's early ecclesiastical structure was tied to the Coptic Church in Egypt, rather than to Rome. That Alexandrian connection matters enormously for the rest of this story, because it explains a theological split that happened a century later and permanently shaped what texts Ethiopia would keep. In 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon convened to settle a dispute about the nature of Christ, specifically how his divine and human natures relate to one another. The council produced a formula that became standard in what we now call Chalcedonian. Christianity, essentially the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox mainstream, but several churches rejected that formula, including the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Armenian Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, and, through its ties to Alexandria, the Ethiopian Church. These churches are collectively known today as Oriental Orthodox, and they hold a Christological position called Miaphysitism, the belief that Christ's divine and human natures exist in a single unified nature without separation or confusion. The Ethiopian Church's own name for itself, Tewahedo, comes directly from this doctrine. It is a Ge'ez word meaning made one or unified, and it refers precisely to this belief about Christ's nature. This split is the single most important reason Ethiopia's biblical canon diverged so sharply from the Western one. After Chalcedon, the Ethiopian Church was cut off from the theological currents flowing through Constantinople and later Rome. It continued developing its own liturgical and scriptural traditions, largely independently, drawing on its earlier connection to Alexandria, on Jewish scriptural traditions that had entered the region even before Christianity through trade, roots and Jewish communities along the Red Sea, and on its own monastic scholarship, all conducted in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language that functions for Ethiopian Christianity, roughly the way Latin functions for Catholicism, or Church Slavonic functions for Russian Orthodoxy. So when people ask why the Ethiopian Bible has so many more books, the honest answer isn't a conspiracy, it's isolation in the literal historical sense. A church that stopped being in regular doctrinal communication with Rome and Constantinople in the 5th century kept developing its scriptural canon on its own terms for the next 1,500 years. Now let's talk about what's actually in those extra books, because this is where the real substance of the story lives, and it doesn't need any exaggeration to be fascinating. The most famous of the Ethiopian-only texts is the Book of Enoch, usually called First Enoch to distinguish it from other Enoch literature. It's attributed to the patriarch Enoch, mentioned briefly in Genesis, as a man who walked with God and was taken by him rather than dying a normal death. First Enoch itself was almost certainly written by multiple authors over a span of centuries, roughly from the 3rd century BC through the 1st century BC, making it a product of Second Temple Judaism rather than something written by Enoch himself. It survives in full only in Ge'ez. Fragments exist in Aramaic among the Dea. DC scrolls found at Qumran, which confirms that portions of the text really did circulate among Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. And Greek fragments exist as well, but the complete text, all the way through, exists only because Ethiopian scribes kept copying it after Jewish and other Christian communities largely stopped. Why does that matter? Because First Enoch was clearly read and respected by at least some early Christians. The New Testament book of Jude directly quotes it, citing Enoch, the 7th from Adam, and prophesying divine judgment in language lifted almost verbatim from the Enochic text. Early church fathers, such as Tertullian, argued explicitly that Enoch should be considered authoritative scripture. Others, including Augustine and Jerome, argued against its canonicity, partly because of doubts about its authorship and partly because of its content, particularly its elaborate account of fallen angels called the Watchers, who intermarry with human women and father a race of giants, an expanded and much stranger retelling of the brief, cryptic passage in Genesis chapter 6 about the sons of God and the daughters of men. That debate was resolved differently in different regions. In the Latin West, Enoch was excluded. In Ethiopia, it never was. Jubilees is the second major text unique to the Ethiopian canon, and it functions as an expanded retelling of Genesis and part of Exodus, organized around a calendar system based on periods of 49 years, called Jubilees. Like Enoch, it was composed during the Second Temple period, likely in the 2nd century BC, and fragments of it were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tell scholars that it was taken seriously by at least some Jewish groups of that era, quite possibly including the Essene community associated with Qumran. Jubilees offers additional narrative detail on figures like Abraham and gives a theological framework for Israelite law that some scholars believe influenced later rabbinic tradition, even though it was not ultimately included in the Hebrew canon. Then there are the 3 books of Maccabean, sometimes confused with the books of Maccabees found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but they are not the same texts at all. The Ethiopian Maccabean books are a separate, distinct set of writings with their own narratives, dealing broadly with resistance to oppression and idolatry, and they exist only in the Ethiopian tradition. The New Testament portion of the Ethiopian canon, 35 books rather than the familiar 27, is a more complicated case because Ethiopian tradition itself distinguishes between what's called the narrower canon, used in most everyday church life, and a broader canon that includes additional ecclesiastical and liturgical material, such as the Synodos, a collection of church order texts, the Book of the Covenant, which contains material presented as instructions from Christ to the apostles, the Didaskalia, an early Christian text on church discipline and community life that also exists in versions used by other ancient churches, including Syriac Christianity, meaning it wasn't uniquely Ethiopian to begin with, and other texts sometimes attributed, likely honorifically, rather than literally, to Clement of Rome. This is also the reason you'll sometimes see figures larger than 81 floating around online, numbers like 80, 8, because different scholars and different publishers count these liturgical and canonical adjacent texts differently depending on whether they're treated as scripture proper or as authoritative church tradition alongside scripture. The Ethiopian Church itself, through its Holy Synod, officially recognizes the 81 book count, and in 2022 it released, for the first time, the complete 81 book canon in a single published Ge'ez edition, a genuinely significant event in the Church's modern history, and one that had nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It's worth pausing here to correct a very common myth, one that shows up constantly in videos like the one this script is responding to, because it's factually wrong and it matters. The claim usually goes that the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD decided which books belonged in the Bible and which ones were suppressed. The Council of Nicaea did not do this. Nicaea was convened to address the Arian controversy, a dispute over whether Christ was truly divine or a created being, and it produced the original form of the Nicene Creed. It said essentially nothing about the biblical canon. The actual process of settling the New Testament canon in the Western Church happened gradually, over decades, through figures like Athanasius of Alexandria, who, in his Easter letter of 367 AD, listed the 27 books that would become the standard New Testament, and through regional councils such as the Synod of Hippo in 393 and the Councils of Carthage in 397 and 419, which affirmed similar lists for use in North Africa. There was no single imperial decree, no secret committee erasing inconvenient gospels at Constantine's command. The process was messy, regional, debated over generations by many different bishops and scholars in different regions, including Ethiopia, simply arrived at different conclusions about where to draw the line, largely because they weren't part of the same conversation to begin with. That's a less dramatic story than Rome hid the truth, but it's the true one, and honestly, it makes what happened in Ethiopia more impressive, not less. Ethiopian Christians didn't preserve a secret version of Christianity that a global conspiracy tried to suppress. They preserved their own independent scriptural tradition, shaped by Alexandria, by Jewish literature that had circulated in the region since before Christianity arrived, and by 13 centuries of Ge'ez monastic scholarship, largely undisturbed because Ethiopia sat outside the political and ecclesiastical structures that eventually standardized the Western canon. The physical preservation of this tradition is itself a remarkable, well-documented story. Ethiopian monasteries, some built into cliff faces, some carved directly downward into solid volcanic rock, as in the famous rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, commissioned by King Gebre Meskel Lalibela in the 12th and 13th centuries, have functioned for centuries as manuscript workshops, as well as places of worship. Monks trained in Ge'ez script hand-copied scripture, generation after generation, using parchment made from goat and sheepskin, producing illuminated manuscripts whose artistic style, with bold geometric patterns and vividly colored figures, is recognized as a distinct tradition within Christian art history. The ancient city of Aksum, the capital of the kingdom that first adopted Christianity under Ezana, remains a major religious center today. An Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark of the Covenant itself resides there, in the chapel of the tablet, guarded continuously by a single monk appointed to that role for life. This is a genuine, deeply held tradition, first, recorded in written form in the 14th century national epic called the Kebre Nagast, or Glory of Kings, which traces Ethiopia's royal line to a son born of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. No outside scholar has been permitted to examine the object the Church says is kept there, which means its authenticity cannot be independently verified. But the tradition itself, and its centrality to Ethiopian religious identity, is entirely real and worth understanding on those terms, rather than as either a proven fact or a hoax. There's also a legitimate scholarly conversation, separate from all of this, about parallels between the worldview found in texts like Jubilees and First Enoch, and the worldview of the Essene community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Both share an interest in tightly structured calendars and angelic and cosmic hierarchies, and in a sharp moral division between light and darkness. Scholars generally don't claim that Ethiopian Christianity descends directly from the Essenes, since the Essenes were a Jewish sect that predates Christianity and largely disappeared after the Jewish-Roman Wars of the first century, but the textual overlap does support something narrower and still significant. That some of the literature preserved by Ethiopian Christians reflects strands of Second Temple Jewish thought that were widely read around the time of Jesus, then gradually fell out of circulation almost everywhere else. On the question of political independence, the popular claim that Ethiopia was never colonized is repeated constantly, and it's mostly true but not entirely, and the accurate version is more interesting. Ethiopia, under Emperor Menelik II, decisively defeated an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a victory that made Ethiopia the only African state to successfully resist European colonization during the scramble for Africa and secured its independence for another 4 decades. That independence was interrupted between 1936 and 1941, when fascist Italy under Mussolini invaded and occupied the country, forcing Emperor Haile Selassie into exile until British and Ethiopian forces drove Italian troops out during World War II, and Haile Selassie was restored to the throne. So the fuller and more accurate statement is that Ethiopia is the only African nation to defeat a European colonial power in open war and maintain independence for the vast majority of the colonial era, with one significant 5-year interruption. That distinction is still historically extraordinary, and it did shape the country's ability to maintain its own religious institutions on its own terms for far longer than almost anywhere else on the continent, without needing embellishment to make the point. It's also worth being precise about Haile Selassie's actual role in the biblical canon, since the earlier claim in circulating videos that he made the narrower version official gets the emphasis backwards. Haile Selassie, who reigned from 1930 until he was deposed in 1974, was a significant modernizing patron of the church, and during his reign there were efforts to standardize and formalize Ethiopian religious institutions as part of a broader nation-building project. But the 81-book canon as recognized today is the product of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo, Church's Holy Synod and its own internal doctrinal tradition, refined and formally published over time, most recently and completely in that 2022 Ge'ez edition, rather than the personal decree of any single monarch. So what does all of this actually tell us once you strip away the manufactured mystery? It tells us that Christianity was never a single uniform thing handed down intact from the first century. It diversified early along real geographic, political, and theological lines in different communities, separated by real distances, real language barriers, and a real 5th century doctrinal split at Chalcedon made different decisions about which ancient texts to preserve as sacred and which to set aside. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church didn't preserve a hidden alternate Christianity, kept secret by monks defying a global power structure. It preserved its own legitimate, well-documented, richly developed Christian tradition openly, continuously, for over 1,000 years, discussed in academic literature, cataloged by manuscript scholars, and increasingly available in translation for anyone who wants to actually read it, rather than watch a video that claims an AI just discovered it. None of this required Grok. It required, at most, a search engine and a willingness to read primary and academic sources, rather than repeat a script built for engagement. The books are real. The 81-book Canon is real. First, Enoch and Jubilees surviving in Aushof. Complete form only in Ge'ez, while existing only in fragments elsewhere, is real and genuinely remarkable. Aksum's role as one of the ancient world's great trading kingdoms and one of the first states anywhere to adopt Christianity as a matter of royal policy is real. Lalabella's rock-hewn churches are real, and you can visit them today. What isn't real is the idea that any of this was secret, that it was erased by a conspiracy at Nicaea, or that a chatbot uncovered a lost prophecy warning about modern televangelists. Ethiopian Christians have known what's in their Bible for 1,500 years. The only new information here is that some people outside Ethiopia are finally hearing about it, and they deserve to hear about it accurately. If you found this genuinely interesting, the next step isn't waiting for another AI-generated mystery video. It's picking up a real translation of the Kebre Nagast, or a scholarly edition of 1st Enoch, or reading about the Council of Chalcedon and the Oriental. Orthodox churches, because the true history here rewards curiosity far more than the manufactured version ever could. If you want more videos like this, ones that take a viral religious claim and actually check it against real sources, subscribe, leave a comment with what you'd like fact-checked next, and share this with someone who's seen that other version of the story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.